Anevarakam Vanakkam. 6 years ago, the very first time I spoke in this boardroom was about Tamil Heritage Month. So 6 years later, it's something that I don't take lightly. I'm reflecting on Toronto being home to the largest Tamil diaspora outside of the homeland, and what my representation means. That's a duty and privilege that I don't take lightly. So as a student, I'm reflecting as a former TDSB student. Oftentimes, the only time the others would get to speak about their identity was on multicultural days. And on those days, our identities were reduced to the food we ate and the clothing we wear. But now, with the History and Heritage Month, we're actually able to take a deeper dive and better understand the journeys our communities have taken, the richness of the heritage, the pain, the trauma, and the resiliency. And I think that's an extremely powerful thing to explore. One thing that I'm often reflecting on is the important relationship of being Tamil and land. Probably many times over the past 1 month, you've heard Tamil people say with a lot of pride that the Tamil language is one of the oldest living languages. And though we are multi-faith as a people, we are people that are united by our language, and that's something that we identify ourselves by. And one way of looking at a people, at a community, and understanding how advanced their language is by looking at their literature and their grammar. And if you look at Tamil culture, we have a very deep and thorough literature that goes back to 3rd century BCE. And our literature talks a lot about poetry. It talks a lot about land. We have classifications of land by land type, by soil, by the animals, by plants, by the people that live there and their occupation. And it really shows that as a community, we were so in tune of ourselves, our environments, and nature. I'm also thinking of modern day and how in my homeland, our people were colonized by the Portuguese, the British, the Dutch. I'm also reflecting on 70 years of occupation, oppression by the Sri Lankan government, the ongoing genocide, and colonization of ancestral lands, and what it means when our library, the Jaffna Library, which housed primary sources and manuscripts, the only place on earth where I can go back and learn about my history, and that too was burned down by the Sri Lankan army. And this shows this constant threat to Tamil language and history. And being Tamil is political, and our existence is political, our history is political, and remembering for us is political. And that is another reason why Tamil Heritage Month is something that's so important to us. And when we look at how we come to this land, again, that relationship to being Tamil and living on indigenous land, and what it means to reflect on our privilege and how we stand in solidarity with these communities. And the theme for Tamil Heritage Month speaks to unmehal and kadehal, which is truths and our stories. And it's important to reflect that even as a system, how we treated Tamil students. Just like it's always important to reflect on residential schools and how the impact of residential schools on indigenous communities and intergenerational trauma. It's important to remember the history of how TDSB has treated racialized students, especially Black students. And I'm reflecting on when our Tamil community started arriving in the masses as a refugee group in Canada in the late 80s and 90s. I'm reflecting on how there was a lack of understanding and a lack of empathy that these students had escaped violence and genocide and are survivors, and how when they entered our system, they were met with a lack of understanding. There was culture shock. There was bullying of Tamil students and expulsions and suspensions of Tamil boys. And these are things that happened. But as a resilient community and a lot of engagement of Tamil youth by Tamil advocacy groups, we see the community grow from that. And we see that as a community, we are very hardworking. Our parents worked multiple jobs. They found the time to also teach us about our Tamil culture and identity, but also get us very involved in raising awareness about the genocide back home and getting involved in protests. And this term and the previous term, we're very privileged to have three Tamil trustees represent this board. And I think our representation goes beyond just ourselves, and we stand on the shoulders of the community that built this foundation for us. And so when I think of that, it's something that I don't take lightly. I'm also reflecting on how this same board has, the very first Somalian trustee, Trustee Hassan, the very first Latin American trustee, Trustee D. Davidas, and how when we take up space on school boards, not only does our representation go beyond a diversity checklist, what we mean is we get to challenge biases and challenge systemic barriers and systemic discrimination that was once used against us. And I think when we say not again for one community, we mean not again for any community. And I guess this past 1 month, I've been reflecting on the immense power and privilege that I hold as a trustee and how I must spend my privilege advocating for those who think that their voices don't matter or that their experiences don't matter and they don't have a voice. And I'll end off with one of my favorite Tamil quotes that I've quoted quite a few times in this boardroom, which is Rauthiram Paraga. Learn to get angry. Use your anger to fight back injustices, fight back inequities, and see how we can serve our communities in an equitable manner. So thank you again to the Tamil Heritage Month Committee, to teachers, to principals, and to my Tamil community. And I owe, the success of Tamil Heritage Month, I think, to those very first parents that arrived on this land. I can't imagine the hardships. I can't imagine raising your children without knowing the language and the culture, but still giving us so much. We owe this to you. Nandri.